As we do upon this ground withdraw from the Prelatical Curates, and likewise from some of our covenanted brethren, upon the account of their being chargeable with such corruptions and defections from our Reformation as we cannot but show our dislike of. This the reverend author of Rectus Instruendum justifies in Confutation 3, Dialogue, Chapter 10, page 8, where he is showing what separation is not sinful, and gives this for one. If we separate in that which a national church hath commanded us as her members to disown, by her standing acts and authority, while those from whom we separate own that corruption, which holds true of the curates and indulged and addressers and all that we withdraw from. However it be, certainly those are to be withdrawn from with whom we cannot communicate without submitting to the laws establishing them, and taking on that test and badge of our incorporation with them, and partaking of their sin and in hazard of their judgment. Number 4. Though in some cases, as we are warranted, so are necessitated to withdraw, yet neither do we allow it upon slight or slender grounds, nor can any tender soul be forced to discountenance the ministers of Christ. I do here speak of the Prelatical Curates. Without great reluctancy and grief of heart, even when the grounds of it are solid and valid, and the necessity unavoidable. Therefore we reject these as insufficient grounds. Besides what are given already, firstly, we cannot withdraw from a minister for his infirmities or weakness, natural, spiritual, or moral. Secondly, neither for his personal faults and escapes. We expect a faithful, but not a sinless ministry. Thirdly, nor for every defect in faithfulness, through ignorance, want of courage, misinformation, or being biased with affection for a particular persons. We do not hold that faults in members or defects in ministers do pollute the ordinances and so necessitate a separation, but agree with what Mr. Durham says on Revelations chapter 2, lecture 6, page 147, in quarto, sincerity discovered will cover many faults. Fourthly, nor from every discovery of hypocrisy, though we may have ground to suspect a man's principle and motive may be not right. Yet, if he be following duty unblameably, and have a lawful call, what then? Quote, notwithstanding every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, therein we may rejoice. Philemon 1, verse 18. Fifthly, nor yet for real scandals, not attended with obstinacy, if ministers will take reproof and admonition, and, at least by doctrinal confessing and practical forsaking them, satisfy the offended. Sixthly, yea, though his scandals be so gross that we must discountenance him when he persists in them, yet that is not a disowning of his ministry, or a rejecting his commission, but a discountenancing for his disorders until they be removed. By the Apologetic Relation, section 14, pages 290 and 291, says, quote, first, there may be ministerial corruptions that cut the very throat of the office and make one no officer, and it is past questioning. Such may be shunned without all hazard of separation. Number 2, when personal faults are very gross and palpable, open and avowed, such may be shunned without any hazard of separation, because the man's being an officer before God is much to be questioned, and there is great probability that by the very deed itself he had forefaulted the same, though such should be the corruption in a church, that notwithstanding of all this he may be maintained. Thirdly, separation is one thing, and not hearing such or such a man is far another thing. There may be just grounds of exception against a particular person why people may refuse to countenance him without any hazard of separation, or joining with separatists in their principles. Separation is one thing, and refusing to attend the ministry of such a man is another thing. For a man may join with ordinances in another congregation, and so testify that he hath no prejudice at the ministry, but only against such a man in particular. Unquote. Whence it is an ignorant as well as malicious calumny to say that our withdrawing from the curates, and also from some ministers whom otherwise we respect and reverence as godly ministers for their offensive defections, is a disowning all the ministry of Scotland. Whereas we do profess indeed a disowning of the curates' ministry, but for our reverend Presbyterian ministers, though we do not discountenance many of them with sad hearts, for not keeping the word of the Lord's patience in this hour of temptation, nor adhering to the principles and constitutions of the Church of Scotland, yet this is not a disowning of their ministry, but a refusing to countenance them in their present administrations in this disturbed state till these offenses be removed. Number 5. As to disown the ministry were hateful sectarianism, so to dissolve or break off communion with the true church, whereof we are members, would be an unnatural schism, which is horrid sin. But because among all the various sufferings wherewith the poor, tossed, and racked remnant, now persecuted, have been exercised, this hath not been the lightest, and they have not been on all hands stigmatized, as schismatics and separatists, not only because they have maintained a resolved withdrawing from the curates, but also have discountenanced many Presbyterian ministers with whom they have had been offended for their declining courses and compliances with the time's corruptions, and forsaking in a great measure the duty of this day. I shall distinguish some cases of separation out of the writings of our approved authors, which will justify all their withdrawings. Firstly, Mr. Durham distinguishes these three schisms separating from the unity and communion of a true church, consisting not always in diversity of doctrine, but in divided practices, according to that of Augustine. It is not a different faith makes schismatics, but a broken society of communion. Then separation either in whole from a church, as no church, or in part in some things wherein they cannot communicate with that corrupt church, which is lawful if it exceed not its ground. Then, lastly, secession, a local removing to a better church. The first of these cannot be imputed to the persecuted wanderers, for they separate from no true church whereof they were members, but these from whom they separate will be found to be the schismatics. Secondly, the second of these, to wit separation, is either positive and active or negative and passive. The first is when a party not only leaves communion with the church whereunto they were formerly joined, but also gathers up new distinct churches, different from the former, under another government and ministry and ordinances, disowning those they left. The latter is when the faithful remnant of a declining church, standing still and refusing to concur with the backsliding part of the same church, after they have become obstinate in their defections, hold closely by and adheres unto the reformation attained. This famous Mr. Rutherford, in his Due Right of Presbyteries, page 253 and 254, showeth to be lawful, and calleth it a non-union, as that in Augustine's time, when the faithful did separate from the Donatists, which is lawful and laudable. Quote, third, Mr. Rutherford there proceeds to distinguish between a separation from the church in her worst and most part, and a separation from the best and least part. And these who separate from the worst and greatest part do notwithstanding retain a part of and a part in the visible church, because they do not separate from the church according to the least and best part thereof, as the godly in England who refuse the popish ceremonies and anti-Christian bishops. Hence it will follow that though people should not withdraw from communion with the greatest part of the church, which is now corrupted, they cannot be counted separatists, because they hold full communion with the better, though lesser, part. Moreover, he saith, page 254 and 255, that there may be causes of non-union with the church, which is not sufficient causes of separation. Lastly, he tells us in the same place, page 258, when the greatest part of the church makes defection from the truth, the lesser part remaining sound, the greatest part is the church of the separatists, though the manyest and greatest part of the actual exercise of discipline be the church, yet in the case of right discipline, the best, though fewest, is the church. For truth is like life. He that retireth from the manyest members unto the heart, and there remaineth in its foundation in case of dangers, so that it is the major part which hath made defection, that are to be accounted separatists, and not such who stand on their principles, though they cannot comply or join with the corrupt majority. Thus the apologetic relation rehearsed his words, section 14, pages 292 and 293. Fourth, there may be a lawful withdrawing where the ordinances and ministry are not cast at, as the apologetic relation, page 291, quote, so then, so long as people do not cast at the ordinances, but are willing to run many miles to enjoy them, nor cast at the church as no church, though they sadly fear that God shall be provoked by this dreadful defection, which is carried on by these men and their favorers, to give her a bill of divorce, nor at the ministry, for they love those that stand to their principles dearly, and are most willing to hear them either in public or private. Number 5, it is granted by all that write against separatists, that separation from a church is lawful when the case so falleth out, that union cannot be kept with her without sin." Unquote. Sixth, the grave author of the Rectius Instruendum, third dialogue, chapter, page 7, etc., quote, "allows every separation is not schism, even from the church which hath essentials, yea, and more than essentials, if it be from those, though never so many, who are drawing back from whatever piece of duty and integrity is attained, for this is still to be held fast according to the many Scripture commands. So Elias, when God's covenant was forsaken, was at another Athanasius, I and I only am left, in point of tenacious integrity." Seventh, next he says, "If we separate in that which a national church hath commanded us as her members to disown by her standing acts and authority, while those from whom we separate own that corruption." Eighth, likewise he there asserts there is a lawful forbearance of union and compliance with notorious backsliders in that which is of itself sinful, or inductive to it, which is far from separation strictly taken. The commands of abstaining from all appearance of evil, and hating the garment spotted with the flesh, do clearly include this. Ninth, he adds, many things will warrant separation from a particular minister or congregation, which will not warrant separation from the church national, nor infer it by Mr. Durham's acknowledgment on Scandal, page 129. For if scandals become excessive, he allows to depart to another congregation. Lastly, he says, there is a commanded withdrawing from persons and societies, even in worship. The precepts, Romans 16:17, 2 Corinthians 6:17, Proverbs 19:27, Acts 2:40, will clearly import this by consequence. Surely the ministers and professors adhering to the Reformation must be the true Church of Scotland, though the lesser number. These soldiers who keep the general orders are the true army, not the deserters of the same. But, secondly, it being a part cleared by these assertions, what is our mind in this controversy, I shall lay down from Scripture oracles all the causes and cases justifying and warranting withdrawing from any ministers, with application of all of them to the curates, and accommodation of some of them to all that the wanderers withdraw from. The arguments endeavoring to evince the validity of them, and evidencing they are not new notions, but the same grounds which approved authors have improved in this controversy. I shall omit the ordinary criticisms in stating the question, in distinguishing betwixt hearing and joining in worship, and owning them as ministers and submitting to them, etc., and only essay to prove this thesis. We cannot, without sin, own church communion and gospel ordinances with the prelates or their curates as our ministers, but must withdraw from them, and any other guilty of the like corruptions which we can make out against them. I shall not resume what confirmations this thesis is strengthened with from the testimonies or church constitutions or former periods which are permitted in the foregoing discourse, nor make any repetition of the circumstances of our present condition represented above, which contributes to clear it, but shortly come to the arguments. Number 1. It is necessary that we must acknowledge them ministers of Christ and his ambassadors clothed with his communion, from whom we receive the ordinances of the gospel. For otherwise they must be looked upon as thieves, robbers, usurpers, and strangers, whom Christ's sheep will not, nay, must not hear. John 10, verses 1 and 5. And quote, how shall they preach, unquote, or be heard, quote, except they be sent, unquote. Romans 10, verse 15. For such whom we know may not lawfully preach, we cannot lawfully hear. These from whom we may receive the mysteries of God, we must account ministers of Christ, 1 Corinthians 4, verse 1, and ambassadors for Christ, standing in his head, beseeching us to be reconciled to God, 2 Corinthians 5:20. Hence, such as we doubt to acknowledge ministers of Christ, clothed with his commission, them we cannot hear without sin. But the prelatical curates are such as we doubt to acknowledge ministers of Christ, clothed with his commission. Therefore we cannot hear them. The minor needs only probation. These who neither have nor can have the qualifications of a minister of Christ cannot be acknowledged with confidence to be ministers of Christ clothed with his commission, but the prelatical curates are such. Ergo, first, they neither have nor can have the qualifications of Christ's ministers, since few of them have the personal as Christians, far less the ministerial as officers, mentioned in 1 Timothy 3, verses 2 and 3, and Titus 1, 6 and 9, except it be to be, quote, husbands of one wife, unquote, and if that do not make them ministers, they having nothing else, especially four, are wanting in all of them.